Saint Francis Xavier, S.J., born Francisco de Jasso y Azpilicueta, was a Navarrese Basque Roman Catholic missionary, born in Xavier, Kingdom of Navarre, and a co-founder of the Society of Jesus. He was a companion of Saint Ignatius of Loyola, and one of the first 7 Jesuits who took vows of poverty and chastity at Montmartre, Paris in 1534. He led an extensive mission into Asia, mainly in the Portuguese Empire of the time, and was influential in evangelization work, most notably in India. He also ventured into Japan, Borneo, the Maluku Islands, and other areas which had, until then, not been visited by Christian missionaries. In these areas, struggling to learn the local languages and in the face of opposition, he had less success than he had enjoyed in India. It was a goal of Xavier to extend his missionary preaching to China, but he died in Changshuan Island shortly before doing so. Saint Francis Xavier was beatified by Pope Paul V on 25 October 1619, and was canonized by Pope Gregory XV on 12 March 1622. In 1624 he was made co-patron of Navarre alongside Santiago, known as the Apostle of the Indies, and the Apostle of Japan. He is considered to be one of the greatest missionaries since St. Paul. In 1927, Pope Pius XI published the decree Apostolicorum in Missionibus, naming St. Francis Xavier, along with Saint Therese of Lisieux, co-patron of all foreign missions. He is now co-patron saint of Navarre with San Fermin. The Day of Navarre in Spain marks the anniversary of Saint Francis Xavier's death on 3 December 1552. Early life. Francis Xavier was born in the castle of Xavier, in the Kingdom of Navarre, on 7 April 1506 according to a family register. He was the youngest son of Juan de Jasso y Atondo, who belonged to a prosperous farming family and had acquired a doctorate in law at the University of Bologna, and later became privy councillor and finance minister to King John III of Navarre. Francis's mother was Doña María de Azpilicueta y Neres, sole heiress of 2 noble Navarrese families. He was thus related to the great theologian and philosopher Martin de Azpilicueta. Notwithstanding different interpretations on his first language, no evidence suggests that Xavier's mother tongue was other than Basque, as stated by himself, and confirmed by the socio-linguistic environment of the time. In 1512 Ferdinand, King of Aragon and Regent of Castile, invaded Navarre, initiating a war that lasted over 18 years. 3 years later, Francis's father died when Francis was only 9 years old. In 1516, Francis's brothers participated in a failed Navarrese-French attempt to expel the Spanish invaders from the kingdom. The Spanish governor, Cardinal Cisneros, confiscated the family lands, demolished the outer wall, the gates, and 2 towers of the family castle, and filled in the moat. In addition, the height of the keep was reduced by half. Only the family residence inside the castle was left. In 1522 one of Francis's brothers participated with 200 Navarrese nobles in dogged but failed resistance against the Castilian Count of Miranda in Amaya, Bastorn, the last Navarrese territorial position south of the Pyrenees. Until he left for studies in Paris in 1525, Francis's life was surrounded by this war, which ended with Spanish conquest of Navarre in 1530. In 1525, Francis went to study at the Collège Saint-Barbe, University of Paris, where he would spend the next 11 years. In the early days, he acquired some reputation as an athlete and a fine high jumper. In 1529, Francis shared lodgings with his friend Pierre Favre. A new student, Ignatius of Loyola, came to room with them. At 38, Ignatius was much older than Peter and Francis, who were both 23 at the time. Pierre was won over by Ignatius to become a priest, but Francis had aspirations of worldly advancement. At first Francis was not much taken with Ignatius. He regarded the new lodger as a joke and was sarcastic about his efforts to convert students. Only after Pierre left their lodgings to visit his family, when Ignatius was alone with the proud Navarrese, he was able to slowly break down Francis's stubborn resistance. According to most biographies, Ignatius is said to have posed the question, "What will it profit a man to gain the whole world, and lose his own soul?" However, according to James Broderick, such method is not characteristic of Ignatius, and there is no evidence that he employed it at all. In 1530 Francis received the degree of Master of Arts, and afterwards taught Aristotelian philosophy at Beauvais College, University of Paris. On 15 August 1534, 7 students met in a crypt beneath the Church of Saint Denis, in Montmartre outside Paris. They were Francis, Ignatius of Loyola, Alfonso Salmeron, Diego Lainez, Nicolas Bobadilla from Spain, Peter Faber from Savoy, and Simão Rodrigues from Portugal. They made private vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to the Pope, and also vowed to go to the Holy Land to convert infidels. Francis began his study of theology in 1534 and was ordained on June 24, 1537. In 1539, after long discussions, Ignatius drew up a formula for a new monastic order, the Society of Jesus. Ignatius's plan for the order was approved by Pope Paul III in 1540. Missionary work. In 1540 King John of Portugal had Pedro Mascarenhas, Portuguese ambassador to the Vatican, request Jesuit missionaries to spread the faith in his new Indian possessions, where the king believed that Christian values were eroding among the Portuguese. After successive appeals to the Pope asking for missionaries for the East Indies under the Padroada Agreement, John III was encouraged by Diogo de Gouveia, rector of the College St. Barbe, to recruit the newly graduated youngsters that would establish the Society of Jesus. Loyola promptly appointed Nicolas Bobadilla and Simão Rodrigues. At the last moment, however, Bobadilla became seriously ill. With some hesitance and uneasiness, Ignatius asked Francis to go in Bobadilla's place. Thus, Xavier accidentally began his life as the first Jesuit missionary. Leaving Rome on 15 March 1540, in the ambassador's train, Francis took with him a breviary, a catechism, and De Institutiono Benevivendi by Croatian humanist Marko Marulic, a Latin book that had become popular in the Counter-Reformation. According to a 1549 letter of F. Baltasar Gagoingoa, it was the only book that Francis read or studied. Francis reached Lisbon in June 1540, and 4 days after his arrival, he and Rodrigues were summoned to a private audience with the king and the queen. Francis Xavier devoted much of his life to missions in Asia, mainly in 4 centers: Malacca, Amboina and Ternate, Japan, and China. His growing information about new places indicated to him that he had to go to what he understood were centers of influence for the whole region. China loomed large from his days in India. Japan was particularly attractive because of its culture. For him, these areas were interconnected, they could not be evangelized separately. Goa in India. He left Lisbon on 7 April 1541, Xavier's 35th birthday, along with 2 other Jesuits and the new viceroy Martim Afonso de Souza, on board the Santiago. As he departed, Francis was given a brief from the Pope appointing him apostolic nuncio to the East. From August until March 1542, he remained in Portuguese Mozambique, and arrived in Goa, then capital of Portuguese India, on 6 May 1542. 13 months after leaving Lisbon, following quickly on the great voyages of discovery, the Portuguese had established themselves at Goa 30 years earlier. Francis's primary mission, as ordered by King John III, was to restore Christianity among the Portuguese settlers. According to Teotonio R. de Souza, recent critical accounts indicate that apart from the posted civil servants, the great majority of those who were dispatched as discoverers were the riff-raff of Portuguese society. picked up from Portuguese jails, nor did the soldiers, sailors, or merchants come to do missionary work, and imperial policy permitted the outflow of disaffected nobility. Many of the arrivals formed liaisons with local women and adopted Indian culture. Missionaries often wrote against the scandalous and undisciplined behavior of their fellow Christians. The Christian population had churches, clergy, and a bishop, but there were few preachers and no priests beyond the walls of Goa. Xavier decided that he must begin by instructing the Portuguese themselves, and gave much of his time to the teaching of children. The first 5 months he spent in preaching and ministering to the sick in the hospitals. After that, he walked through the streets ringing a bell to summon the children and servants to catechism. He was invited to head St. Paul's College, a pioneer seminary for the education of secular priests, which became the first Jesuit headquarters in Asia. Xavier soon learned that along the pearl fishery coast, which extends from Cape Comorin on the southern tip of India to the island of Mannar, off Ceylon, there was a jati of people called Paravas. Many of them had been baptized 10 years before, merely to please the Portuguese, who had helped them against the Moors, but remained uninstructed in the faith. Accompanied by several native clerics from the seminary at Goa, he set sail for Cape Comorin in October 1542. First he set himself to learn the language of the Paravas. He taught those who had already been baptized, and preached to those who weren't. His efforts with the high-caste Brahmins remained unavailing. He devoted almost 3 years to the work of preaching to the people of southern India and Ceylon, converting many. Many were the difficulties and hardships which Xavier had to encounter at this time, sometimes because the Portuguese soldiers, far from seconding his work, hampered it by their bad example and vicious habits. He built nearly 40 churches along the coast, including St. Stephen's Church, Kombutherai, mentioned in his letters dated 1544. During this time, he was able to visit the tomb of St. Thomas the Apostle in Mylapore, then in Portuguese India. He set his sights eastward in 1545 and planned a missionary journey to Makassar on the island of Celebes. As the first Jesuit in India, Francis had difficulty achieving much success in his missionary trips. His successors, such as de Nobili, Matteo Ricci, and Beschi, attempted to convert the noblemen first as a means to influence more people, while Francis had initially interacted most with the lower classes. Southeast Asia. In the spring of 1545, Xavier started for Portuguese Malacca. He labored there for the last months of that year. About January 1546, Xavier left Malacca for the Maluku Islands, where the Portuguese had some settlements. For a year and a half he preached the gospel there. He went first to Ambon Island, where he stayed until mid-June. He then visited other Maluku islands, including Ternate, Baranura, and Morotai. Shortly after Easter 1546, he returned to Ambon Island. A few months later he returned to Malacca, Japan. In Malacca in December 1547, Francis Xavier met a Japanese man named Anjiro. Anjiro had heard of Francis in 1545 and had traveled from Kagoshima to Malacca to meet him. Having been charged with murder, Anjiro had fled Japan. He told Francis extensively about his former life and the customs and culture of his homeland. Anjiro became the first Japanese Christian and adopted the name of Paulo de Santa Fe. He later helped Xavier as a mediator and translator for the mission to Japan that now seemed much more possible. In January 1548, Francis returned to Goa to attend to his responsibilities as superior of the mission there. The next 15 months were occupied with various journeys and administrative measures. He left Goa on the 15th of April 1549, stopped at Malacca, and visited Canton. He was accompanied by Anjiro, 2 other Japanese men, Father Cosme de Torres, and Brother João Fernandes. He had taken with him presents for the King of Japan, since he was intending to introduce himself as the Apostolic Nuncio. Europeans had already come to Japan. The Portuguese had landed in 1543 on the island of Tanegashima, where they introduced the first firearms to Japan. From Amboina, he wrote to his companions in Europe, "I asked a Portuguese merchant, who had been for many days in Anjiro's country of Japan, to give me some information on that land and its people from what he had seen and heard. All the Portuguese merchants coming from Japan tell me that if I go there I shall do great service for God our Lord, more than with the pagans of India, for they are a very reasonable people." Francis Xavier reached Japan on the 27th of July 1549, with Anjiro and 3 other Jesuits. But he was not permitted to enter any port his ship arrived at until the 15th of August, when he went ashore at Kagoshima, the principal port of Satsuma province on the island of Kyushu. As a representative of the Portuguese king, he was received in a friendly manner. Shimazu Takaiza, daimyo of Satsuma, gave a friendly reception to Francis on the 29th of September 1549. But in the following year he forbade the conversion of his subjects to Christianity under penalty of death. Christians in Kagoshima could not be given any catechism in the following years. The Portuguese missionary Pedro de Alcacova would later write in 1554, "In Canjoximas, the first place Father Master Francisco stopped at, there were a good number of Christians. Although there was no one there to teach them, the shortage of laborers prevented the whole kingdom from becoming Christian." He was hosted by Anjiro's family until October 1550. From October to December 1550, he resided in Yamaguchi. Shortly before Christmas, he left for Kyoto but failed to meet with the emperor. He returned to Yamaguchi in March 1551, where he was permitted to preach by the daimyo of the province. However, lacking fluency in the Japanese language, he had to limit himself to reading aloud the translation of a catechism. Francis was the first Jesuit to go to Japan as a missionary. He brought with him paintings of the Madonna and the Madonna and Child. These paintings were used to help teach the Japanese about Christianity. There was a huge language barrier as Japanese was unlike other languages the missionaries had previously encountered. For a long time Francis struggled to learn the language. Having learned that evangelical poverty had not the appeal in Japan that it had in Europe and in India, he decided to change his method of approach. Hearing after a time that a Portuguese ship had arrived at a port in the province of Bungo in Kyushu and that the prince there would like to see him, Xavier now set out southward. The Jesuit, in a fine cassock, surplice, and stole, was attended by 30 gentlemen and as many servants, all in their best clothes. 5 of them bore on cushions valuable articles, including a portrait of Our Lady and a pair of velvet slippers, these not gifts for the prince, but solemn offerings to Xavier, to impress the onlookers with his eminence. Handsomely dressed, with his companions acting as attendants, he presented himself before Oshindano, the ruler of Nagate, and as a representative of the great kingdom of Portugal, offered him the letters and presents, a musical instrument, a watch, and other attractive objects which had been given him by the authorities in India for the emperor. For 45 years the Jesuits were the only missionaries in Asia, but the Franciscans also began proselytizing in Asia as well. Christian missionaries were later forced into exile, along with their assistants. Some were able to stay behind, however Christianity was then kept underground as to not be persecuted. The Japanese people were not easily converted. Many of the people were already Buddhist or Shinto. Francis tried to combat the disposition of some of the Japanese that a God who had created everything, including evil, could not be good. The concept of hell was also a struggle. The Japanese were bothered by the idea of their ancestors living in hell. Despite Francis's different religion, he felt that they were good people, much like Europeans, and could be converted. Xavier was welcomed by the Shingon monks since he used the word Dainichi for the Christian God, attempting to adapt the concept to local traditions. As Xavier learned more about the religious nuances of the word, he changed to Doisu from the Latin and Portuguese deus. The monks later realized that Xavier was preaching a rival religion and grew more aggressive towards his attempts at conversion. With the passage of time, his sojourn in Japan could be considered somewhat fruitful, as attested by congregations established in Hirado, Yamaguchi, and Bungo. Xavier worked for more than 2 years in Japan and saw his successor Jesuits established. He then decided to return to India. Historians debate the exact path he returned by, but from evidence attributed to the captain of his ship, he may have traveled through Tanashima and Minato, and avoided Kagoshima because of the hostility of the daimyo. During his trip, a tempest forced him to stop on an island near Guangzhou, China, where he met Diogo Pereira, a rich merchant and an old friend from Kochi. Pereira showed him a letter from Portuguese prisoners in Guangzhou, asking for a Portuguese ambassador to speak to the Chinese emperor on their behalf. Later during the voyage, he stopped at Malacca on the 27th of December 1551, and was back in Goa by January 1552. On the 17th of April he set sail with Diogo Pereira on the Santa Cruz for China. He planned to introduce himself as Apostolic Nuncio and Pereira as Ambassador of the King of Portugal, but then he realized that he had forgotten his testimonial letters as an Apostolic Nuncio. Back in Malacca, he was confronted by the Capitão Alvaro Duarte da Gama, who now had total control over the harbour. The Capitão refused to recognize his title of nuncio, asked Pereira to resign from his title of ambassador, named a new crew for the ship, and demanded the gifts for the Chinese emperor be left in Malacca. In late August 1552, the Santa Cruz reached the Chinese island of Shangshuan, 14 kilometers away from the southern coast of mainland China, near Taishan, Guangdong, 200 kilometers southwest of what later became Hong Kong. At this time, he was accompanied only by a Jesuit student, Alvaro Ferreira, a Chinese man called Antonio, and a Malabar servant called Christopher. Around mid-November he sent a letter saying that a man had agreed to take him to the mainland in exchange for a large sum of money. Having sent back Alvaro Ferreira, he remained alone with Antonio. He died at Shangshuan from a fever on the 3rd of December 1552, while he was waiting for a boat that would agree to take him to mainland China.